And to start things off and to moderate the event, it's my pleasure to have the chance to introduce the star of Marketplace. Although David Brancaccio thinks he's the star, and David's steadying back, but he's made a star of Marty Kaplan, who's a commentator in Marketplace and former producer, television producer and writer. But in academia, he's known as the Associate Dean of the Annenberg School for Communication and the Director of the Norman Lear Center. And he's going to be running the show tonight. Marty Kaplan.
The topic that we're speaking about tonight, creativity, commerce, and culture, contains in it a core tension, the tension or bargain between the freedom and rights of the individual artist and the freedom and rights of property owners, the owners of copyright and intellectual property. It is a complex ecology that includes, at one end of the system of the kind of artistic food chain, the creator, and at the other end, the consumer. Peter Guber talks about the creator being the eureka end and the consumer being the oh wow end. And everything in between, which consists of a realm which is business or commerce or the marketplace, a realm which is technology, media, ways of enabling that transmission to occur, and a public realm embodied in our norms, in our government, in our rules and regulations, which say that there ought to be various systems or rules to be observed, which have come to be, in our case, rules of copyright, intellectual property, fair use, public domain, to govern those transactions. And out of them comes something which is a culture. And we're going to be looking at all aspects of that tonight. I'm delighted to be able to have as our Sherpas in this investigation. I cannot think of two better people to have this discussion. So I'm going to introduce them, invite them to join me up here, make a couple of comments about the format, and then we're off to the races. So first, I'd like to introduce, and I'm only going in alphabetical order, someone who is really at the forefront of these issues. If you ask legal scholars or people involved in the internet or any aspect of intellectual property, who is the most influential voice in this area taking a particular point of view, which you will hear tonight, our guest tonight is that person. He has been a Supreme Court clerk. He has been a professor at Harvard, at the Berkman Center. He is now a professor at Stanford Law School. His prior book, called Code, is one of the most widely discussed books about the Internet. And his new book, which is called The Future of Ideas, may, if we're lucky, be available in the lobby upstairs. Please welcome Larry Lessig. To introduce our other guest, the thing that I have to start with is a memory seared into my brain, and I suspect many others of yours here. It was 38 years ago last week that on Air Force One, a photograph was taken of Lyndon Johnson taking the oath of office, and Mrs. Kennedy near him. They were heading back to Washington after the traumas that occurred in Dallas, and a young man then and a young man now who was present at those events, who was in this photograph. I think our friend Liz Carpenter found the Bible, and Lyndon Johnson was sworn in. He then became a special assistant to President Johnson, and then in 1966 became the head of the Motion Picture Association of America. The motion picture industry is a place where if you're in your job for 18 months, it's considered a miracle. This gentleman has been in his position since 1966 as the head of the organization of all those people. And not only is he internationally known, a decorated spokesperson, an advocate for the industry, he is also someone that I had the honor of interviewing when I briefly worked at National Public Radio 20 years ago. And so, Jack, I brought a copy of your book, too, Speak Up with Confidence, which I have kept since then. Please welcome Jack Valenti.
Thank you very much.
I know I have a hope to understand something before the evening is over. And it's something from each of you gentlemen. From Larry, what I'm interested in learning is at a time when the new Harry Potter can be found now on the streets of Kuala Lumpur and Beijing being sold and counterfeited, at a time when more music is still being downloaded than ever before, how can artists possibly make money? How is what you believe consistent with the ability of the creative community to flourish and to thrive? And Jack, what I'd like to learn from you before the evening is over is, I know you say that there's such a thing as fair use. I know you believe in the political system as a way of putting a check on the demands of corporations and the consolidation of power. My question is, given current practice, what is it that will check the power of the corporations which you so ably represent? How is it that anyone can possibly get an inch when they have an adversary like you on the other side? So that having been said, the only other thing I'd like to add before opening it to these gentlemen is to say that this is round 2 of Lessig versus Valenti. Round 1 occurred at the Berkman Center at Harvard, and it's a lively piece of online video if you'd like to see it. And we are thrilled that from Harvard, direct to the Annenberg School for Communication, these two gentlemen, so please welcome them, and Larry, perhaps you'd begin.
Well, I am indeed honored, and I have to say that this is an extraordinary measure of Jack Valenti, that he would open this discussion up here between two people who share a common ideal about the value of freedom and free speech and creativity, but two fundamentally different ideas about how we get there. So I want to first thank you, Jack, that you would allow this conversation to occur like this, especially since it's round 2 and we had so much fun in round 1. But I think it's only appropriate that when we have round 2 of this boxing match, we have an appropriate costume that allows us to celebrate this debate in all its grandeur. So,
well, you look better in shorts.
And we save the shorts for later, Jack. So Marty sets this up by asking how it is we can assure that there is some opportunity for creators to earn what they deserve in the creative process of producing their art. And I think that's absolutely the right question to ask. And it's a different question. It's a different question from the way this question is typically framed, which is about whether people should be allowed to steal artists' content. If that's what anybody thinks this debate's about, let me tell you, I'm not going to take the side that says people should be allowed to steal artists' content, because I don't think artists, like anybody else, should be subject to the theft of other people of their legitimate and rightful work. But this debate isn't so much about whether people should steal, but what the appropriate balance is between the rights that the artist has and the opportunity that other artists have to build on the creative work that has gone before. And I think the real difference between the two positions here is, in my view, the intellectual property laws, the product of Congress and the work that people that I produce for a living have done, has expanded far too much, such that the opportunity for creativity built on these intellectual property laws is too fundamentally controlled and concentrated, and begins to stifle the very type of innovation that I believe we should have. So in the course of this debate, I promise to lay out how it is we establish some system that protects the rights of authors and creators to earn some return without the level of stifling control that I think we risk right now. So let's start with that.
All right. First, thank you very much, Larry, for those kind remarks. And when this is over, I shall embrace you and kiss you full on the lips, manfully, of course. And Marty, I want to thank you for that wonderful introduction. Painfully brief, I thought, but that's all right. I am glad to be here, although I'd like to say that I think that, well, let's just say, I say, and maybe somebody else has said it, that the sum total of culture and commerce and law that we're going to talk about is umbilically connected to the philosophy of Marcel Proust. I haven't the foggiest idea what that means, I must say. So I'm going to take as my text tonight. This is it. Future of Ideas, the latest book of Larry Lessig, for which I might say I paid him the highest compliment I know. I bought this book at full retail price. It cost me $30. That means, and it is copyrighted, that under the copyright laws, he made about $5.50 off that book. And it seems to me that if Larry had the fortitude of his convictions, he would have told his publisher to give it away. But he didn't. All right. So, everything I say tonight is going to be taken from Larry's book, his writings. That's my Bible. Now, I think what I'd like to do is to sum up what I think this book says, and I've read every bloody word of it, and I must say, the use of eloquent prose that you've composed is, I must say, I found enticing. You have really enriched the nobility of the simple English sentence, and I congratulate you on that. It's a very readable book, though I didn't agree with almost any of it. Let me tell you what Larry, I think, is what he's saying in this book. I quote, he says, copyright is out of control. That's a direct quote. He believes that copyright is stifling innovation, inventiveness, and progress in this new digital world, which, by the way, is just one of many new technologies that have intruded on our society, beginning with the telegraph and semaphore signals and television and the computer and others. And all of them have had to address themselves that they have to operate under some kind of standards and rules. And he believes that copyright is destroying fair use. And I think that's what's in this book. Now, it just so happens that in politics and in war and in romance, timing is everything. So let me take you right to the heart of this thing. This is an issue that Larry feels very strongly about. On page 190 of his book, he hurls some very heavy stuff at a case that took place in the Second Circuit called the DCSS case, in which I think he says he uses the DCSS case to make his point that this case shows copyright at its most grotesque distortion, crushing fair use, and I might add, demolishing the freedom of the web. Now, what is the CSS case? CSS stands for Content Scrambling System. It allowed people with DVDs to put them out with this code in there that disallows anybody to watch this free of charge. You pay it on your computer after you buy the DVD. Some very innovative folks got together and broke the code called DCSS, decrypting. And what did they do? They put this code-breaking series on the internet for 6 billion people to have access to. And the courts then took it over. The district court, Judge Kaplan presiding, issued an immediate injunction forcing them to stop distributing this material. Now, in his book, Professor Lessig says that the district court was palpably in error. And very optimistic, he says, and the Second Court of Appeals has that case, and let's just wait to see the outcome. So I said earlier, timing is all. 24 hours ago in New York, the Second Circuit handed down its decision. Now here first is the heart of the Judge Kaplan decision. I'm going to read one sentence in the last paragraph of his crisp, compact, and very readable and understandable, which is very rare for lawyers. Other than Larry Lessig, few of them write well. Listen to Judge Kaplan's last sentence. The excitement of unlimited access to untold quantities of information has blurred in the minds of some that taking what is not yours or what is freely offered to you is stealing. Period. Unquote. Now let me take you through briefly, because this is so important, a summary of this Second Circuit Court opinion. Because like Zeno's arrow, it goes straight to the heart of Professor Lessig's beliefs, and I might add, cleanses the debate for the future. Now, here is what it says.
Can I just interrupt to say that the New York Times said, quoting, I'm not chortling or anything, Jack Valenti said.
Well, I didn't think I was chortling. I was delighted, but not chortling. There's a big difference. And I go through this because these are terse little sentences. But they're very important because this is the latest decision handed down by the Second Circuit. Now, by the way, Professor Lessig in his book calls the Ninth Circuit here in California the Hollywood Circuit. I'm sure he's going to call the Second Circuit the Hollywood Second Circuit. I don't know what he's going to do with the other 5 or 6 circuits before he's done. In considering, said the court, on page 51, the scope of First Amendment protection for the decryption program like DCSS, we must recognize that the essential purpose of encryption code is to prevent unauthorized access. Now listen to this. Owners of all property rights, and that sure as hell includes Screen Actors Guild and the Screen Directors Guild and the Screenwriters Guild and studios and every creative person, and as well as the craft unions. They have an interest in it. Owners of all property rights are entitled to prohibit access to their property by unauthorized persons. On page 51, he says the DCSS is computer code that can decrypt CSS. In its basic function, and I'm so proud to say that I've used this metaphor myself, so I really applaud the Second Circuit. It is like a skeleton key that can open a locked door, a combination that can open a safe, or a device that can neutralize a security device attached to a store's product. Page 56. The government's interest in preventing unauthorized access to encrypted copyrighted material is unquestionably substantial, and the regulation of DCSS by prohibiting its exhibition clearly serves that interest. Now here comes fair use, which I think is one of the core assets of Professor Lessig's argument, which I say he makes in a most enticing way. The appellants contend that DMCA, Digital Millennium Copyright Act, as applied by the district court, unconstitutionally eliminates fair use of copyrighted material. That's what the defendant said. We reject this extravagant claims of the Second Circuit. We note that the Supreme Court has never held that fair use is constitutionally required. Page 69. Appellants have provided no support for their premise that fair use of DVD movies is constitutionally required to be made by copying the original work in its original format. We know of no authority, said the court, that fair use as protected by the Copyright Act, much less the Constitution, guarantees copying by the optimum method or in the identical format. And finally, fair use has never been held to be a guarantee of access to copyrighted material in order to copy it by the fair user's preferred technique or the format of the original. Now, I would like to hear Professor Lessig rebut the Second Circuit.
Please.
And tell me what is the next one. Perhaps he will argue before the Supreme Court, where his former mentor, Justice Scalia, will hear it, and I think Justice Scalia will find it unwise to collapse the the concept of private property, if I have read Justice Scalia's decisions in the past rightly. Professor Lessig, cross-examine.
Yes, sir. So, Jack, the last time you sounded so confident about a decision, at least from the readings that I've done of yours, which are extensive in the congressional record, was a testimony you gave in 1982 before Congress after the Ninth Circuit. I didn't call it the Hollywood Circuit. This is what Judge Kaczynski calls the Hollywood Circuit. The Hollywood Circuit had unanimously held that VCRs were an illegal technology and they could be banned. And you, speaking before Congress, applauded that decision with about as much love and attention as you applauded the decision of the Second Circuit. But as we know, even though, as you said in that testimony, quote, I say to you, this is wonderful, brilliant, beautiful, I say to you that the VCR is to the American film producer and the American public as the Boston Strangler is to a woman at home alone.
I must tell you I love that. I really do. And frankly, I'd like to say it again.
Even though you applauded the decision with such and there's much more, but I couldn't go into it all, rhetoric then, the Supreme Court, rightfully, in my view, took a different view of the VCR technology. What they established in the Sony Betamax case was the question about a technology is whether the technology has a potential for a substantial non-infringing use. Now, the Second Circuit has made its decision. I have not had as much chance as you had to go through it, so I won't criticize the decision directly. But I do want to talk about the DMCA, which you have raised, and ask these people, as they hear these cases, to ask themselves whether this sounds like the quintessentially reasonable regulation that you talk about. So, for example, Sony makes a little dog called the Aibo. It dances and jumps around. You pay $1,500 for the privilege of having this robot dance around on your floor, but this is what the Sony Aibo does. A man decided to crack the technology of the Sony Aibo to make it so he could make his dog dance to jazz. And he did this. And he then tried to share with other people the way to make a dog that they had purchased dance to jazz. Posted it on his website. Soon got a call from the lawyers from Sony saying, this is a violation of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. You have facilitated the cracking of a technology that's designed to protect copyrighted works, namely our ability to control whether our dog dances jazz or not. Case one. Case two. Edward Felton, a professor at Princeton University, a researcher about encryption technology, researches the encryption technology protecting something called the Secure Digital Music Initiative. He discovers the Secure Digital Music Initiative is crafted with an extremely poor encryption technology. He decides to write a paper and present the paper at an academic conference describing the weaknesses of the SDMI encryption system. He receives a letter from a lawyer representing RIAA. The letter says, in terms that couldn't be more clear, you should realize that if you present your academic paper, you are risking prosecution under the DMCA for facilitating the cracking of a technology that enables copyright protection. Case 3. A Russian in Russia writes a bit of code to enable people to unlock an Adobe ebook. Right? An Adobe ebook is an electronic book. My book has been released in an Adobe ebook form. In the Adobe ebook form for my book, they have absurd restrictions on people's use of that book. My publisher did it. I fight the publisher, but it turns out, though my friend Jack Valenti will talk to me, my publisher won't talk to me about this issue. The code for the ebook, for example, forbids you to copy any text out of the ebook into memory or print any pages off the ebook or to use a technology to read the book aloud. All of this is forbidden by the code. Dmitry Sklyarov wrote a bit of code to make it so you could crack the Adobe ebook. Now, why would you want to crack the protection of the Adobe ebook? Some people want to crack the protection of the Adobe ebook so that they can take my book and enter into the resale market for Lessig books and make millions and millions of dollars by posting my ebook outside of the control of Adobe. That's what some people want to do. And those people are criminals. I agree. But some people want to crack the protection system so that, for example, if they're blind, they can use their read aloud technology to read the text aloud. Or if they want to put it on another machine that they might have at their home, they can put it and back it up on their other machine. In fact, that's why Dmitry Sklyarov was writing this code. Now, Dmitry comes to the United States to give a lecture in Nevada about the weaknesses in Adobe's encryption system. Adobe doesn't like this much. Adobe calls the U.S. attorney and says to the U.S. attorney, this Russian hacker is coming here to talk about our system, and we bought his code online, and he's therefore violated the DMCA. They arrested Dmitry, held him for jail for 6 weeks. He now faces 25 years in jail for a technology that can both be used to do bad things and can be used to do good things. Now,
I voted to execute him.
You would execute him, okay. Okay, let's just put this in perspective. Right? We live in a country where there's a technology called a handgun. A handgun is used to kill 10 children a day. This technology is an extremely dangerous and, I think, evil technology. But when a child is killed with a handgun, people at Smith & Wesson don't fear that the U.S. attorney is going to knock on their door and lock them up and send them to jail for 25 years for developing a technology that can be used to commit a crime. Instead, Smith & Wesson says, our technology is used for bad purposes, but also for good purposes. And rather than attacking the technology, attack the criminal. Now, that's exactly what the DMCA case in the Second Circuit is about. Because the part that Jack didn't tell you about the technology in New York is that DCSS did not make it any easier to copy a DVD movie. You could always copy a DVD movie without decrypting it. All that the DCSS technology did was to enable you to play a DVD movie on a machine that the DVD licensing organization had not licensed. For example, a Linux machine. So what is the crime in somebody buying a DVD movie, coming home, discovering it doesn't play in his Linux box, downloading a bit of code so that he can crack it and play it in his computer? It's his DVD. It's a completely fair use of this technology. And the law that makes it a crime to enable him to use that fair use seems to me to be wildly extreme without even getting to whether we should execute the poor Linux user.
You know, Professor Lessig, I just gave you the indictments of the Second Circuit. When I was working in the White House, we were preparing the president for a press conference. He had decided he was going to change ambassadors in South Vietnam, but he hadn't made it public yet. And one of us said, you know, Mr. President, you're going to get that question. Are you thinking about changing ambassadors? And they'll have you cold. And he said, "You're right. What do you think I ought to do?" And somebody said, "I'll tell you what. Don't answer it. Just say, yes, I'll come back to that later," and then you go on and answer another question that you know somebody else is going to ask.
He was a great...
Now, that's what Professor Lessig just did. He didn't want to handle that Second Circuit because I promise you, in the back of the room as you leave tonight, we have excerpted 2.5 pages of the summary of that Second Circuit. I hope you'll pick it up and read it, because it demolishes clearly and cleanly and concisely in readable prose really the essence of Professor Lessig's book about copyright. Now, he talked about Sony Betamax. Well, he didn't tell you what Sony Betamax said and didn't say. The Sony Betamax case, as you know, came down in 1983, a 5-4 decision in the Supreme Court, which held that it was infringing, but it also had other uses besides illegally infringing, so they said, okay. But here is what the court said. And I invite Professor Lessig to tell me, here I am, untutored in canon law and civil statute, a non-lawyer up here, and one of the brilliant explorers of law and culture in this country. Why am I here? It's a stupid answer. I don't know why. I shouldn't be here. This is what the court said. The court said in Betamax, it is okay to time shift. That is, to copy an over-the-air broadcast. Not a cable program, not a premium cable program, not a pay-per-view program, but an over-the-air broadcast. That you time shift it, watch it later, and guess what? Erase it. That's what the court said. It did not deal at all with anything else about copying. And understand, the court said that time shifting was a fair use, but it was not a right, which is exactly what the Second Circuit has said. I invite Professor Lessig to tell me more about that Second Circuit decision, because I will bet you this, 10 will get you 40 that he's read that decision in great detail. I promise you he has. Now, he's vexed at the Congress because he says the Congress gives too long a period to copyright protection. And he said they have no right to do that. And indeed, I don't know whether your case would you're challenging the constitutionality of it, and I pray that it finally makes its way to the Supreme Court, because in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, and very few specific art forms are in that Constitution, but copyright is. And it says the Congress shall have the power. It didn't say may have the power, or possibly, or most probably. Shall have the power, just what the First Amendment, those wonderful 45 words of spare, unadorned phrases that guarantee all the other clauses in the Constitution. It says Congress shall make no law, not maybe, possibly, or perhaps, but no law. Congress shall have the power to set copyright terms in a limited fashion. It determines what limit it is. Now, the same thing goes in Section 2 of the Constitution about the President's right to pardon. It is absolute, though we may criticize the President for pardoning some fugitive who fled the country. Criticism is okay, but the power is absolute. The power of Congress to limit is absolute. And I want you to know that we're not dealing with limited here, with Euclidean geometry, where the equations are pure and precise and always equal and measured. We're dealing with subjectivity, which is always writ with a muffled pen. In his book, Professor Lessig quotes one of my great heroes, a man named Garnet Hardin, professor of philosophy at Oregon, who wrote a great book called Promethean Ethics. And in this book, Professor Hardin poses the perplexing question, which to philosophy is the same thing as the due process clause in the law, and the lawyers get very rich on debating what is due process. Professor Hardin says, how much is enough? And the answer is, when it is more than enough. Now try that on without the advice of Euclid sometime, and you will see what subjectivity is all about. And by the way, the European Union has granted to its authors a copyright term which is now well beyond 100 years. So in his declaration of opposition to copyright in this country, I suggest he go global with this and take on the European Union as well. And later on, I'll get to I Crave because I want to discuss that. That's a very important part of his book. And in some cases, Professor Lessig is like the striptease artist who takes off some, doesn't take off all.
I promise I won't take off all tonight. So, Jack quotes the Constitution, sort of. A slight paraphrase of the Constitution. Let's just be exactly clear of what the Constitution says. Article 1, Section 8 says, Congress has the power to, quote, promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries. This is the only clause in the Constitution granting Congress power that expressly sets the purpose of the grant in the grant itself. It is to promote the progress of science. That's what the grant of power is. Now, Jack refers to a statute which I am challenging. A bunch of us are challenging in this Eldred versus Ashcroft case, something called the Sonny Bono Copyright Term Extension Act, affectionately referred to as the Mickey Mouse Protection Act, because Congress has gotten into the habit of extending the term of copyright whenever it comes up to them that it's in their great wisdom to extend it. So, in the first 100 years of copyright in America, Congress changed the term once. In the next 50 years, Congress changed the term once again. In the last 40 years, Congress has extended the term of copyright 11 times, extended the term of existing copyrights 11 times, and it's called the Mickey Mouse Protection Act because it just so happens that when Mickey Mouse is about to fall into the public domain, just on the corner, on the edge, over the edge, Mickey Mouse is about to fall into the public domain, Congress gets around to extending the term of copyright. Now, the question, the constitutional question is, does extending the term of already existing works promote progress? Does it promote progress in the way that the framers imagined progress should be promoted? Because the framers had a very simple formula in mind. It was a quid pro quo. You do this, we'll give you that. You create new work, we'll give you a monopoly protection to protect it for a limited time. The framers protected it for 14 years, renewable once. We now have a term of the life of the author plus 70 years, which in the case of somebody like Irving Berlin means 140 years of protection. Now they said, quid pro quo. You produce, we give you protection. And the whole claim in this case is, what is the quid pro quo that the Disney Corporation is getting when they're getting more protection for Mickey Mouse, but have to do nothing in exchange? They put out movies called The Hunchback of Notre Dame, Pocahontas, they have Fantasia, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, all this wonderful Disney work that draws on the public domain, but they articulate in Congress a principle that is, they should own their property forever. They can use stuff from the public domain, regardless of whether the Victor Hugo estate is outraged at the Hunchback of Notre Dame. That's not their concern. But they have the right to protect their work forever. Now, I submit, Jack, this is not the framers' vision. It might be yours, might be everybody's here, right? But if I get the chance to stand before the Supreme Court, the first person I'll look to and say, this is unconstitutional, is my Justice Scalia, because I'll say the framers' vision of copyright is not the vision articulated by Jack Valenti in the VCR hearings in 1982, where he said, quote, creative property owners must be accorded the same rights and protection resident in all other property owners in the nation. That's not what the framers of our Constitution believed, because the very same Constitution that says if the government takes your house, it must pay you money, says the government must take your intellectual property after a, quote, limited time and turn it over to the public. Now, Jack, do you understand why they wanted to do it like that? Were they just budding communists, those framers of the United States Communist, that they didn't understand the simple points about property which you so eloquently push? Or do you think you might have missed something about what they were onto when they believed that ideas and culture should not be owned, but it should be free, that it should fall into the public domain, not that there should be no copyright protection? Obviously, they created the right to create copyrights. But those rights are to promote progress, not to enable large publishers to continue to hold monopoly rights for apparently an infinite time, so long as infinity is reached by limited terms. Now, you know, when Mary Bono was speaking about the Copyright Term Extension Act, which was named for her husband who had died, she said, Sonny Bono wanted the term of copyright protection to last forever. I am informed by staff, she said, that such a change would violate the Constitution. And she said, but of course there's Jack Valenti's proposal that the term last forever minus a day.
I like that. Yeah, I'll buy that.
Now, I'm not arguing about whether it's a good idea or a bad idea. I'm happy to argue about that. But I just want to know, why do you think the framers would have believed that that's the appropriate way to think about copyright? Why did they create a 14-year term?
I never knew that Professor Lessig was a psychic. He's got into the minds now of John Dickinson and George Mason and James Madison, that this is what they were thinking. Whenever anybody says the original intent of the framers, that's all bullshit. Because there is no authentic document that shows what was in their minds. If you read the Madison notes, which I have, they're very cryptic. And there are about 6 or 7 others, Luther Martin among others, who kept diaries. But they're all wallowing in imperfection. Nobody got into the heads of these framers. You just read what you want to read. Now, you are one of the great lawyers in this country, Larry. Are you telling me that when the Constitution says whatever the intervening words are, Congress shall have the power to set for limited times copyright? Are you saying that that's subject to constitutional disapproval?
It doesn't say that, Jack.
Well, it does say that.
It says Congress has the power to promote progress.
Don't dandy dance around this thing. It says has the power to set for a limited time, does it not? Forget the intervening words for whatever reason.
Right. Forget the intervening words.
All right. Now, okay,
that's exactly the argument. Forget what the framers said.
No.
Just look at what Jack believes.
No. But you see, we're dealing here with what we call legal sophistry, and that is just as I might criticize Bill Clinton for pardoning
now we're going to have to put the gloves on. You used the word sophistry.
That's legal sophistry. And I'm telling you, we get before the Supreme Court, you won't be able to practice that kind of deceptive language. You've got to come to the heart and core of this issue. Does Congress have the authority to set for limited times copyright? The answer is it most assuredly does. Now let's go back to pardon. Same thing. The president shall have the power to pardon. Even though we hate the fact that he pardoned Mark Rich, and we got a hell of a lot more criticism for that than you have on copyright terms. But every legal scholar in the country says without contradiction, it is absolute. So I want to stick to what I think is what we're all about. And that is that copyright is out of control, that it is stifling innovation and invention on the internet. If Mickey Mouse has copyright for the next 1,000 years, tell me how that stifles innovation. How does it stifle invention? The fact that Harry Potter, if you could bring down Harry Potter free of charge to billions of people all over this world, would that mean the continuance of a free democratic republic in this country?
No, but Jack, I haven't said that.
No, wait a minute now. Just a second. I got my Boston Strangler thing coming up here in a minute. Now, I want to give you, though, to me, I don't want to stray from this thing. I want to deal with the Second Circuit. I want to deal, is copyright wrong or is it right? And whether or not it hurts anybody that somebody has a copyright on their material. Now, here's my favorite. God, I love this. It's on page 203 of this book. And if you do nothing, read this. This is my favorite Lessig citation. He cites the decision in the Vanna White case before the Ninth Circuit of Appeals as one of the great societal calamities of this century and the last century. It might even be up there with the Dred Scott decision. I didn't even know about the Vanna White decision, to be honest with you. The Ninth Circuit granted Vanna White the right to control the uses of images which resembled her. Now, one may ask the question, who the hell cares? I mean, but that's a subject for another seminar. Now, Professor Lessig praises Judge Kosinski. It turns out that the judges he most admires are those who espouse his own views. He says, Judge Kosinski says, the fact, and by the way, when Judge Kosinski wrote his dissenting opinion in the Ninth Circuit, he had great dizzying moments, dizzying Maalox moments as he wrote this, because, am I going too fast for this group? Maalox moment, forget it. And Kosinski believes that this tilted the democratic foundations of this country. Why a denial of Vanna's right to control images resembling her is indispensable to a free and democratic republic escapes the limited scope of my mind. So come back again, Larry. Let's come back. Copyright is out of control. How, even if it's out of control, how does it stifle invention? Okay. How does it stifle innovation?
Excellent question.
Anybody can make a movie, and the fact that movie has a copyright, how does that hurt the internet, for God's sake?
Excellent question. 1936, a woman named Margaret Mitchell wrote a book, Gone with the Wind. It sold millions and millions of copies, translated into 30 different languages. In fact, it has sold more copies than any book except the Bible. Gone with the Wind, when it was written, was under copyright that should have expired in 1993. But because of Congress's practice of extending the term of copyright, Margaret Mitchell's book won't expire from copyright until 2032. Now, as I learned from my mother, who was from the South and forced me to watch this movie hundreds of times and read the book when I could first read, this book tells the story from a certain perspective of antebellum South and what the culture was like. There was a woman named Alice Randall who had a very different view about what the culture was like. She wrote a book called The Wind Done Gone. The Wind Done Gone tells the story of Gone with the Wind, but from the perspective of the African slaves. Alice Randall had a publisher. The publisher was Houghton Mifflin. Houghton Mifflin went to release this book. The lawyers called. The lawyers said, I'm sorry, this book is close to the story of Gone with the Wind, and because it's close to the story with Gone with the Wind, it's a derivative work under copyright law. You may not publish it unless we give you permission. We don't give you permission, and they filed a lawsuit that actually asked the district court to order the books burned. This is the United States. But a court is supposed to order books burned because they violate the copyright law and to stop publication. Now, the district court judge, I think, did a very good job spending 50 pages of an opinion trying to figure out whether Gone with the Wind was too close to Alice Randall's Wind Done Gone story, and he talks about the characters, and he struggles, and finally, at the end, he concludes, too close. So he issues an injunction. It says, you can't publish the book. And if it were allowed, the books would have been burned. It goes to the Court of Appeals. The Court of Appeals looks at this. 8 months later, the Court of Appeals decides, well, you know, fair use, blah, 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 First Amendment, blah, blah, blah. Contrary to the Second Circuit's view, the 11th Circuit firmly believes fair use is a constitutional requirement. They say, you can publish the book. Now, you ask, how does copyright stifle innovation? Let me tell you exactly how. The next author who has a story that dares to question Margaret Mitchell's view of the South will have to hire the lawyers to go into court to defend her right to publish the story. $150,000 later, she'll win the case, fine. But the publisher is going to look at this and say, oh, wait a minute, no, it's too we can't make $150,000 in profit to cover these legal fees, so I'm sorry, we're not interested in this publication. Here's a simple and obvious, and I think replicated in 100 different contexts, example of how this perpetual copyright as it's been expanded to include these derivative rights, inhibits the ability of subsequent creators to actually go back and create in a way which the existing copyright holders don't approve of. Now, of course, they could have told a nice story about how about how Margaret Mitchell got it right, or about exactly how this was the antebellum South. Maybe they would have approved of that. But how is it, Jack, in the United States, that you can be forced to burn a book because you don't adopt the party line as a copyright holder whose copyright should have expired 10 years ago and who is dead and who's already made millions of dollars off of this work disapproves of?
I find this so trivial. Yeah. I feel like Adlai Stevenson tonight. When he was running for president, he spoke to the New Jersey Chamber of Commerce, which was composed of all the business proconsuls, the big business people in the state, and he got up and said, "I'm so glad to be here to see so many of my friends, but none of my supporters." That's the way I feel tonight. And by the way, having said that, I'm overjoyed that in the audience is a very talented film director named Davis Guggenheim, and his absolutely gorgeous wife was one of my favorite all-time actresses, Elizabeth Shue, and I'm so proud to have you here, Elizabeth and Davis. Thank you. It may not be the wind done gone, but she's pretty darn good, I must say that. I'm still anxious for the question. You took one trivial case. Frankly, that lady would never have written her book if Margaret Mitchell hadn't out of thin air conjured up this extraordinary story, the only book she wrote, by the way, that has lived all these years. I think it is a derivative work. And if I were a copyright owner, I'd be damn unhappy that somebody took my original work and tried to make money off it by just turning it around. If I took this book and I took the other side and just lambasted Lessig one page after another, taking everything he said, I would be perfectly free to do that, I guess, although it would be a derivative work in many ways. But that's not the issue. I want to come back again. I don't understand how copyright, which, by the way, is at the core, the indispensable core of this country's creativity, if it diminishes or is exiled or is shrunk in a way that Professor Lessig wants it to do, everyone that belongs to one of the creative guilds or is trying to get into the movie business or in television, trying to create programs there, is putting his future to hazard. Now, let me tell you why I think it goes beyond these vagaries of the law about what was in the minds of the framers, which no living human being born of woman ever knows. And that is this: the copyright industries in this country have over 5% of the gross domestic product of this country. We bring in more international revenues than aircraft, than agriculture, than automobiles and auto parts. Before September 11, we were creating new jobs at 3 times the rate of the rest of the economy. And finally, at a time when we're bleeding from almost $400 billion in deficit balance of trade, the copyright industries have a surplus balance of trade with every single country in the world. No other American enterprise can make that statement. So this goes beyond the boundaries of psychic determination, the framer's mind. Just goes to the very heart of this economy. And it's why copyright must be sustained. Because if you cripple it, or you exile it, or you bury it in some form, it's going to go right to the heart of this economy. Now, that's not a legal argument to be made, but nothing is in a vacuum. And all things are made, the Supreme Court has done many things that have nothing to do with the law, for God's sake. So I'm saying to you, so I've come back again and again, Larry, you never touched the Second Circuit decision. You never said about how fair use is not a right. It's part of the Copyright Act. And by the way, that's in Section 1101 of the Copyright Act. Has to do with fair use. Has nothing to do, though, with a right, a constitutional requirement. Never has. So I come back again. How does Harry Potter, having a copyright of whatever length, how does that stifle somebody from having some new invention on the internet, has some new format for spreading information around. How does that hurt? It doesn't. Indeed, the Internet has had an explosive growth in the last 5 years, going from 100,000 host computers to well over 15 million today, and is growing in exponential speed. I guess what I think Professor Lessig would want is to so cripple copyright that we would be in a state of entropy over the next several years. And I've been looking for a way to use that word entropy for about 16 months now, and I finally found it, but I'm not going to tell you what it means if you don't know. You got to look it up the same way I did. Now, that's the question. And I do not believe that you have answered this question, Larry. And in your book, I didn't go into I Crave, which is a little Canadian thing, where I have to say, with all due respect and affection, and you know somebody's about to shove the dagger in when they say that, you didn't give all the facts. Let me tell you about I Crave, because he sets that up as the intrusion of a brute government called the U.S. government into a Canadian enterprise. I Crave is a website in Canada. Had the idea of stealing, and that's what it was, television program signals from Canadian television stations and American stations beneath the 49th parallel. It brought it into its website. And according to Larry, they were just merely retransmitting program, which he said in Canada is okay with the law. That is not true. The law is very fuzzy, and that will be in the courts because the Canadian broadcasters are protesting. But let me tell you what he didn't tell you I Crave did. This is what gnaws at me on other things similar. I Crave reduced the size of the picture by 1/3. And in that 1/3 of the screen, they sold advertising. Hello, how you like that scam, sports fans? They brought in the TV signal, reduced it, and then sold advertising and said, we didn't do anything wrong, we're just merely retransmitting. But why was the case in the Western District of Pennsylvania and not in Canada? Again, Professor Lessig didn't tell you. The owner of I Crave registered his domain name in Pittsburgh. Simple as that, Larry. That's why the case was in Pennsylvania. But I Crave then had to shut down. Why? You know, in accounting, you always figure out cost of goods sold. The cost of goods sold to I Crave was zero. Didn't pay a dime for the material they were bringing in, and then use that stolen material to make money off of it. No wonder the court threw the book at them and really did shut them down. Now, I don't know. He uses that in his book as an example, though, of the big elephantine country called the U.S. moving in to take a poor little Canadian enterprise that's just trying to help the people by retransmitting. But that's not what they were doing, folks. And that's why the court shut them down. So I want to come back again, Larry. Tell me why copyright is destroying the inventive quality on the Internet.
Right. So if there weren't the Internet, if we hadn't had this revolution in communications technology, and not just the Internet, but digital production, I think you'd probably be right. It wouldn't matter much. Because without the Internet, without digital production, it's basically large corporations that need to be making production decisions because that's the economics of it. And so the economics would mean that we'd have large organizations hiring lots of lawyers, and I produce lawyers for a living, so I like this, right? That wouldn't be a problem. It's because of the Internet, Jack. It's because of the opportunity that the Internet presents that we've got to rethink the extent of copyright. Not whether we should have copyright or not. I'm not saying anybody should be able to steal Harry Potter for at least 14 years. But
tell me why. Why is it wrong if it's 20 years or 30 years? What difference does it make?
Right, here's the story.
I want you to stick to your subject here. Come on.
She thought, we want to encourage a different kind of creativity. Let's do it through film. So she took the digital archive that she could construct of lots of films, many of them old, and she gave people cameras, and she told these people, go out and make film, and you can splice it into some of the other digital archive, and you can create something new using this old stuff, just like Margaret Mitchell did. She didn't think of the Antebellum South story out of thin air. It was the history and the many stories written about Antebellum South that she called upon to produce her work. So this teacher said to her students, do the same thing with film. They produced extraordinary films. Not the quality of Davis's perhaps, but still extraordinary films. They then wanted to make them available to other people. And the lawyers came in and said, no, there's no possibility of making this available to anyone because there's about a bajillion ways in which this violates copyright law. Now, this is only a problem, the extent and expansion of copyright law, in a context where there is a great opportunity for lots of people to be creators. And when I say we have to rethink the extent, I mean we have to rethink the extent given the opportunity for creativity that exists that's much more broad-based than it was before. Now, I don't really think that issue has much to do with iCrave. iCrave, I think, is a very different case. I used iCrave in the book because I wanted to contrast the attitude we have about copyright with attitudes about free speech. So I tell the iCrave story next to another very famous story, the Yahoo in France story, where in France, a French judge, Gomez, shut down the Yahoo auction site and told the Yahoo auction site that because they were selling Nazi paraphernalia and because French law forbid Nazi paraphernalia, they couldn't sell Nazi paraphernalia on their auction site anywhere until they found a way to block out all French citizens. When this decision came down, people in America said, oh my God, this is a terrible violation of free speech. The idea that you could stop the sale of Nazi paraphernalia is fundamental to the idea of free exchange that the internet embraced, and Nazi paraphernalia is the way we demonstrate our commitment to free speech. And France, France is crazy in a lot of ways. France, here too, has violated this principle of the internet. And all I said about iCrave is that if you're going to criticize the French, if this is a deep violation of free speech, why do you think differently about iCrave? Because iCrave was fundamentally the same case. iCrave, under Canadian law, as the judge assumed it to be in the case, he's quite explicit. I'll assume Canadian law makes this legal to transmit, rebroadcast across.
But it doesn't.
Well, he assumed for purposes of the decision that it does. And I think it does. We can argue about that, but let's put that aside because he said, I assume it does. Assuming it does, still they had not adopted sufficiently, they had adopted pretty bad technologies to block out Americans. They had attempted to block out Americans, but the judge essentially said, until you can promise me you will guarantee no American will see this content, you have to shut it down. Well, so that's exactly what the French
Larry,
said.
Do you agree then that it was perfectly okay for them to change the picture, reduce it by 1/3 and sell advertising on the other third? Do you find that to be a laudatory venture for free speech?
Well, Jack, American law is hard enough. I don't know Canadian law. All I know is what the judge said, and the judge said he assumed the action was legal in Canada. So the point is, action legal in Canada bleeds into the United States. United States courts shut iCrave down in the same way that the French courts said, even though it's legal in the United States to sell Nazi paraphernalia, because it bleeds into France, we're going to shut it down, and we'll shut it down until you find a way to block out everybody who's
Well, I find this to be strange. As someone who wears the Legion d'honneur, I'm not unattracted by French culture. But I will tell you this. I find it odd and bizarre that you're saying that our First Amendment, which doesn't exist in France or Great Britain or Germany or anywhere in the European Union, has to be the supreme law of the world. I think that sometimes we Americans think that we are chosen by God to lead the world. There are a lot of religions, there are a lot of languages, there are a lot of cultures in this world that are different from ours. I think France has a perfect right, if as a sovereign country, to pass a law that says we don't allow Nazi propaganda in this country. Now, it would certainly violate our First Amendment, and I would be the first one alongside you say, you can't do that. I hate what they're doing, but by God, you got to let them do it. That's not what happens in France. Are you suggesting that France should adopt our First Amendment? Is that
absolutely,
what you're saying?
absolutely. I wish they would, but absolutely not. That's not what I'm suggesting.
Which would be laudable, but I mean...
what I'm suggesting is it's inconsistent to make fun of the French for what the French are doing and not at all criticize what the Americans are doing. Now, you are being consistent. You think every country should be able to impose its rules on the internet regardless of whether it affects other people other than the particular country at stake. And that's a consistent position, but I wasn't, in this part of the book, arguing against you. In this part of the book, I was arguing against people who don't see there's a free speech issue raised in both cases. Now, you can resolve them the same way as you would, but I think you just at least hope to admit that the extension of the law in this context is a free speech issue. Now, you said, why do I find it laudatory that they should be able to steal this content and make it available and make revenue from it using the advertising? Why do I find it laudable? Well, again, Jack, some historical perspective is very useful here, right? You have consistently argued that copyright should be exactly the same kind of right that any property right is. But historically, that's not been the case. You've heard of the Napster case, which we've fortunately not raised here tonight. But let's talk about the first Napster case, called cable television. Cable television was a technology, came along, set up antenna on top of mountains, stole broadcasters' content, sold it to their customers. That's the Napsterization of broadcasting. Twice, people like you weren't in this battle, I take it, but people like you went to the Supreme Court and said, Supreme Court, you've got to stop this theft of our property. Twice, the Supreme Court said, no, we don't buy it, not theft, not copyright violation, technical blah, 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 lots of lawyer stuff. Conclusion, no violation of the copyright law. So for effectively 20 years, they get to steal this content until Congress finally gets around to sitting down and confronting the issue as they did in the 1976 Act. And when Congress sat down and addressed it, they struck what I think of as a perfect balance for the time. Even though I'm going to agree with you in your wonderful testimony about cable today, I'm all with you about your testimony on cable today. Might have been good for the time, it's no longer good anymore. I'll agree with you about this. But in the context, they struck a perfect balance. They said, authors should be paid. So you can't take this content without paying the copyright owner. But cable companies have a right to get access to this content so that the broadcasters or copyright owners can't leverage their power in the dinosaur industry into a control over the emerging new technology of cable. So they said compensation has to be separated from control through a compulsory licensing right. Now that balance, I think, would be a wonderful balance to strike in the context of the internet as well. So, for example, people think the Napster case is about whether people ought to be allowed to steal content. But Hank Berry, who was the head of Napster, from the very beginning of Napster, was before Congress saying, just give us what you gave the cable company. Give us a compulsory licensing right. We'll pay for the content. But gee, we just want the right to get access to the content because the labels won't give us access to the content because the labels will never embrace new competitors on the horizon.
Let me just tell you about this. Thank God he brought that up. I was there in 1976, and I negotiated this whole Copyright Act with a man named John McClellan, chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee. And when Larry talks about a perfect balance, he's talking about an idealist who's never been in the firestorm of the internal workings of politics in Washington. Senator McClellan had a great friend named Mr. Morrell, who had cable systems in Texas and in Arkansas. And he sure as hell wanted to grow his cable systems. He was a great supporter of Senator McClellan. And I went to Senator McClellan and said, it is wrong not to negotiate. Just say that they have to negotiate a fair marketplace rate. And Senator McClellan says, well, cable, you can't negotiate because cable there's 9,000 cable systems. And of course, 90% of all programs on cable today are negotiated program by program. Isn't that right, Kerry? Absolutely. We do it every day. In those days, the Copyright Act of 76 only pertained to over-the-air broadcast signals of another station, distant signal importation. And I said, let's negotiate it, but not a compulsory license. Let me tell you something, all of you in the movie business, if you ever have a compulsory license on the internet for your product, it will be at one pittance of the marketplace worth of that, and you're going to be in deep-ass trouble. I can tell you that right now. So I negotiated with Senator McClellan, and I finally went back and I said, you know something? This guy owns this Judiciary Committee, and whatever he says is going to go. I've got to negotiate a price for it. We started at 10% of the revenues of stations based on their revenues, and there were several sections, layers. And then the next day I'd go, he said, no, 10% is too much. And he got to 8, and then to 7, and then to 6, and then to 5, and then to 4. And when he got to 3, I said, you know something? It's going to 0. And here's your delicate balance, Larry. We finally settled at about 1.5% of revenues. An unbelievable, bizarre contraction of the marketplace worth of these signals. Now, what has happened is over time, distant signal importation is not near as important now as HBO and Discovery and USA and Fox and all of that. So it's changed. But there's your delicate balance. It was pure, unadulterated politics by a powerful chairman who had all the trumps, and that's how it all came about.
Yeah.
So that's what you have delicate balance, and had nothing to do with copyright. He was just determined this is what is going to happen. But I come back to you again. I still haven't heard the answer. I haven't heard the answer as to why the protection of property, and it is private property. Until it goes into the public domain, it is private property. How on earth the protection of what mostly comes out of Southern California is harming the digital thing? And by the way, digital is all that not great. The computer came before that. Television came before that. The telephone, the telegraph, the Pony Express, the railroads, these were all new inventions that were going to change America. And in time, we found out that you couldn't have Dodge City without a sheriff. You had to have some rules of the game. Right now, the Internet, everybody says, leave it alone. It can't be touched. Why the hell not? Let me tell you the difference, and then I'm done here. The difference, which I'm sure I can hear heavy breathing and gratitude out there. What is the difference between the analog format and the digital format? Most of you know, but for those of you who don't, it's the difference between lightning and the lightning bug. Total difference. A video cassette, you have to have slave machines to copy these, because after the 5th, 6th, or 7th copy, it becomes pretty much unwatchable. And then you have to manufacture the cassette, then you've got to move it out. But even so, my predictions of what would happen with the VCR have come true. I said this would cause theft of our product, and guess what? Today, as Terry McCluggage and Elliot Silverstein, who's in, will tell you, we are losing $3 to $3.5 billion a year on video cassette theft. It's all over the world. Now, what is the difference between digital? You can copy on a digital format 10,000 copies, and the 10,000th copy is as pure and pristine as the original. To allow a movie, Harry Potter, to be stolen on the internet, in a theater on the second day with a digital camcorder, sent to China, and then within 2 days it's called a VCD, which is video compact disc, optical disc piracy. It becomes a pandemic. If you allow that, if you don't have copyright to protect you on the internet, we're dead. Every movie that's on the internet today is illegitimate. A Boston consulting firm named Vian estimated that 350,000 movies are brought down every day, and every one of them is illegal. We don't dare put our movies on the internet now because we can't protect them. I'm trying to set up meetings now with the computer people and the Intels and all of the Silicon Valley type people to see if we can come to some agreement for content encryption, for watermarking, for digital rights management, so that we can protect our valuable products on the internet. That's what we're trying to do right now, because if we can't, I promise you it's disaster time. So I come back again.
Okay, Larry, before you answer or don't answer, depending on your point of view, I would just like to invite anyone who does want to ask a question. We're going to have a brief opportunity for that to approach the microphones, and we'll get to that in just a moment.
Right. So I just think it's a good opportunity to make sure we see how close our two positions are, Jack. We have no disagreement about what's properly called piracy. And we have no disagreement that, of course, Harry Potter and every creator has and should have the opportunity for copyright protection. The only question we're talking about, the only disagreement we might have, is whether perfect control of this, as you call it, property right, might inhibit innovation and growth. Now, you have already taken the position in a different context that too much control exercised by a relatively concentrated industry does harm innovation and is a dangerous technology to permit. In wonderful hearings in 1988, this is the best of Valenti, you said, quote, speaking of the networks, no one industry, no single entity, no group of enterprises ought to be allowed by special grants of congressional privilege to dominate the marketplace and thereby unfairly contend with those who want to compete with them. The losers in that ungainly arrangement are the consumers, and then with a dramatic flourish, always, always, every time, every time. Now, that's all I'm saying about the concentrated exercise of copyrights, which are
but
themselves...
Larry, if you do that, you should be talking antitrust, not copyright.
I am talking
I was
antitrust.
dealing with antitrust laws in this country, not copyright.
I am talking about the antitrust principles that guide us to make sure that a, quote, special grant of congressional privilege, which is a copyright, doesn't enable one industry to protect itself from new competitors. And that's exactly the dynamic that we're seeing in the context of the Internet right now.
I wish you'd take all this Supreme Court as quickly as you can so that we won't have you might be able to dodge the second court decision, but you can't dodge the Supreme Court decision.
Well, join me on the petition, Jack, and we'll both argue that we ought to hear the case of Eldred versus Ashcroft in the Supreme Court. I'm sure they'll listen to you more than they'll listen to me.
I hope they grant certiorari. Have they?
They haven't considered it yet.
All right, okay.
But write
and
a letter.
I just gave you the one legal term that I know. Certiorari. God, I love that.
Question over here.
Actually, a few things.
No, just one. Just one. Sorry.
Okay. There is one thing I'm surprised both of you missed, which is the limitation of the terms of copyright provides an incentive for somebody to create something new, because if their meal ticket from movie one stops, they have to have another sequel or another movie to give them a kick in the butt to get more money coming in. It's like a shark. If you don't create, you die.
Well, I don't buy the starve the artist as a way to get the artist to work theory. My father did, but not me. So I'm not in the school that says we ought to make it so that they have to be kicked in the butt, as you so eloquently put it, to produce. I'm happy Margaret Mitchell made millions and millions of dollars enter her estate. It's just that her grandchildren should be able to continue to control what people say about Margaret Mitchell that troubles me.
Question over here.
It's Arthur Myram. It'll be quick, two-part.
No, one part, please. Just one.
Has to do, first of all, with the Congress having apparently overlooked the fact that recordings of performances were not intended to be copyrighted. But the recent meeting of the Computers and Library Conference pointed out that the two issues that Congress has failed to meet its responsibility. Copyright's one, but where is the electronic post office? And this has repercussions immediately on copyright, because if you consider, for example, that there is an electronic postmark governmentally sanctioned, then you have a great way to go after copyright protection. That is, anything sent over the Internet has to identify where it was purchased originally and who's been transmitting it subsequently, with, of course, penalties for anybody who would attempt to forge or delete these copyright markers, including the marker at time of purchase. Do you have any reflections on that or notions as to where this might be headed?
I don't know how to answer that. I'm sorry.
I would be very anxious about a system that required identification like that for stuff to be sent across the
Well,
Internet.
that's called watermarking, and that's one of the... yeah, watermarking is something that we very much advocate, and but we're unable to get that because we have to have the computers to be able to listen to the instructions on the film that comes down and then be able to respond to that, and thus far, they don't want to do that.
Jim, before I get to you, a question from the internet, from the online discussion group. Will movies ever be made available online through these high-speed pipes in a way acceptable to the movie industry?
Absolutely. Right now, there are about 9.5 million broadband hookups. Access is moving slow. I think one of the reasons, as I've said to the Silicon Valley people, the one reason why there's little interest in broadband is because movies are not there. In a poll taken by the Consumer Electronics Association, they found that 70% of all people in homes who have computers, 70% said all they want off the internet they can get without having broadband. But they did say if there was entertainment, yes, they might be interested in broadband. So, but we can't put our stuff out there, our valuable creative works. And by the way, Mr. McCluggage here from Paramount will tell you that last year, of the 121 films made by the major studios, the average cost, average negative cost, and I'm not talking about marketing, negative cost was $54 million. You add in negative cost to that, and you have an average total cost of $83 million. Now, I don't know about you, but I count that to be serious money. And you can't risk the after theatrical exhibition is where you finally make your money off of this film, not in the theaters. Only 21% of our revenues from abroad come from theatrical exhibition. We have to go to pay cable, you have to go to television, you have to go to pay-per-view, and you have to go to home video in order to retrieve this vast investment. So we are now working to get content encryption, and indeed several of our companies say that in the next 6 months or so they want to be online by going to the computer with content encryption and to see whether or not this would work, because you can, the technology now says you can show it on your computer. You pay $2 for the right to see it, but you can't show it on another computer because the screen will say, I'm sorry, you're not authorized to see this unless you pony up $2. But they're trying to find out whether or not this technology works. And I think that it would be foolhardy, foolish of our companies to go online with their precious product and then have it then delivered, dispatched all over the world at the speed of light. It'd be dead.
It's a great point. I completely agree with you. But here we're going to be on the same side in this debate, because I just saw Yari Landau, who works for Sony, describe the technology that he's developed.
That's what I was talking about.
Right. And it sounds like a great technology. He then described another group of property rights owners who don't like this technology. They're called the cable companies. He went to the cable companies. He was selling this new way to deliver movies across broadband to computers, because, of course, cable companies make money streaming video to television sets. And as he reported at a Stanford event about 3 weeks ago, the cable company said, we will shut off internet access before we would ever allow our property to be used in this way. So
that's
now,
antitrust, Larry.
We're on the same page. Antitrust, call it what you will. I'm talking, as you're talking, as Landau was talking, about the ability of dinosaurs to protect themselves against evolution.
But that's not our debate. Our debate's not in the antitrust division. Our debate is in copyright, which is in the Judiciary Committee of the Congress, House and Senate. But the antitrust division, that's in the Justice Department.
Yeah, well, that's a nice legal distinction, and I give you 2 points on an exam for that.
I don't make the rules, Larry. I just try to live by them.
The fact is, copyright and patents are forms of government-granted monopolies, and it is an antitrust question when we're trying to worry about whether it's too big. That's all we're arguing about. And in the cable context, you and I think, will be on the same side. If they start vetoing your ability to deliver content across the internet because you don't pay them enough or because they just don't want competition with their other video services.
Well, I think we save that for the next debate, because that's
come on, one agreement, Jack. Out of a whole night, you can give me one agreement.
Quick question here.
Okay. Instead of a complicated constitutional law question, let's ask a Norman Lear kind of question for the center. On Tuesday night, there's a new popular series called The Guardian. I don't know if anyone saw that or not, but it raised the issue of copyright and smacked me upside the head. I couldn't believe that Hollywood was going to paint this picture of, it was the copyright of a Bunny Buddy character of little kids painted on the wall, and they were being sued. Which is sort of part of the issue, but the larger question here is that if many of us are here has heard this and been impressed, we wouldn't get ER numbers if we put this on television. But there was part of this debate on a national highly rated series, but with no opportunity for public discussion after it. But I think that's the kind of almost visualizing of the debate, as beautifully, as articulately as you make the cases. Most people can't break that apart.
Did they have boxing gloves in that?
Kerry, who makes The Guardian? You know? Sony? Okay. Sony Pictures? Television.
Over to this side.
Yeah, hi. This question is for Jack Valenti. I'm gathering from your presentation here tonight that you do not believe that there is any fundamental constitutional right to fair use. Correct me if I'm wrong. That being said, do you believe that there is any fundamental social interest in having fair use such that it would apply to all copywritten works?
I'm a great advocate of fair use. I think that, for example, today, if you're a teacher, you can show an entire movie in your classroom without a performance license. Now, that's a privilege that's granted to you under fair use, and I'm wholly in favor of it. But I am against the grotesque distortion of fair use, and that is people that say, I need to be able to break your code because I want to put together a bunch of movies and show an edited version of 5 movies. That's a gross distortion. That's not good. But any teacher that wants to show a full-length movie in their classroom, wonderful. No problem with that at all. And as a matter of fact, you can take several DVDs and you can freeze frame them and show this particular scene, put another one in there, show that scene. There's nothing wrong with that. And indeed, I think it's laudatory.
Over to here.
Professor Lessig, how is it consistent with your viewpoint on copyright when applied to content of the type we're talking about that you have refrained from suggesting or urging that Microsoft be deprived of its copyright and other protection when it abuses its Windows operating system to, among other things, stultify any other innovation in operating systems?
Well, Jack didn't cover the Microsoft part of the book, but there is a Microsoft part of the book, and it is similar to the argument that you're making that is consistent throughout. The owner of the platform, Microsoft, should not be in a position where it can use its power to stifle new innovation. That was the government's case. That's what the Court of Appeals upheld in the government's case, that that's what they tried to do. And I think it's exactly the same debate that we're having in this context, whether an old industry, dinosaur, can use its power to protect itself against innovators. Now, should you force them to give up their copyright? That's a complicated question of what the appropriate remedy is. Jack's told me we're not having an antitrust debate, so I can't get into that debate right now. But I think that might be one solution, although I think it's not the best solution among those that the government has talked about.
I'm sorry to disappoint the other questioners, but there is hot food awaiting us. So I'm going to ask the final question to both, which is, have either, and I'd like to hear from both of you on this, has either of you heard anything from the other which has persuaded you to alter at all your point of view?
Briefly, the answer is no.
I'd like to go on forever. The answer is yes, but I can't go on forever.
I think that Professor Lessig and I are First Amendment advocates. I'm a Hugo Black First Amendment man. I'm an absolutist on the First Amendment, and I defend it. I yield to no man in my defense of it. But I'm also a staunch advocate and indeed a disciple and an acolyte of copyright. I think it's the foundation from which springs the creative industries in this country, which have dominated the world and will continue to do so. And I think that's something that I find to be useful to this country as well as to this region of this country.
So we agree about the First Amendment. We agree about the importance of copyright. Our only disagreement is an antitrust debate. Maybe that's round 3 of Lessig versus Valenti.
Please thank us.
Thank you.